for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Roman, let me ask you more of a theoretical, philosophical question. If there were an animal, and I'm going to say polar bear, but any animal, that were rare in Alaska and their population was declining, but across the national boundary in Canada, it was increasing and thriving in population, would that Alaska population need to be protected, in your opinion, under the Endangered Species Act?
Well, this being completely hypothetical, the law would say if it's considered a distinct population segment. So if there were genetic evidence, there was some evidence that it were separate, then absolutely it should be protected.
But if it was identical?
If it was identical to the others, I can't answer that hypothetical question. But
why would it need to be protected in Alaska if the Canadian population allowed for the propagation of the genetic heritage of that animal?
Because part of the historic range, I would say, in this hypothetical case.
Okay, well, I don't, okay.
It's hard for me to answer that without having some details. I'd be happy to consider it.
Well, you're a professor. I thought you would know these things. Okay, well, let me ask you another sort of theoretical question. If an animal is released into the wild, and for instance, Colorado has a situation where they have been raising fish in captivity that are endangered or threatened and releasing them into the Colorado River. Is there any problem with that, in your opinion, even if the habitat issues would be something you would wish for habitat to be restored for that fish, but there's enough fish being released from captivity into the wild to keep that species going, and thriving?
Well, the law is clear that you protect the endangered species and the ecosystems that they depend on. So if it's just coming from fishery, I suspect not. In other words, coming from a hatchery. But again, it's hard to, I'm not an expert in this area, and I may be a professor, but I don't necessarily have the answers to some of these questions.
Okay. That's interesting because I do have a suspicion that some people in the environmental community are really more after grabbing the habitat, and they really don't care about the species. They want the land tied up and preserved for their reasons. One more question, and then I have a question for Megan. But I'm not a bird expert, but I know among bird watchers there's a division, a controversy at times between what's called the lumpers and the splitters. People that lump species or subspecies together into one, and those that consider these populations actually separate. Is the science always absolutely crystal clear, or is there sometimes subjectivity or even arbitrariness in the scientific decisions that are made as to where one species leaves off and another one begins?
Well, the law, again, is clear here. It should be made by the best available science. So you bring in experts in that field, and they make the decision. It should not be arbitrary. It should be transparent, and it should be, a decision made by consensus among scientists and experts.
Okay, and Megan, I'm going to switch to you now. He mentioned transparency, which is, I agree, is a vital issue. Is the data that the Fish and Wildlife Service or NMFS uses always transparent, or is it sometimes held close by that agency?
I think that the studies that they are relying on, at least when it comes to sage grouse, are generally available, but the underlying data isn't. So I don't know that I would say fish is necessarily holding it back. It might be fish in some instances. It might be the researcher in others.
Well, in any cases, I don't mean just fish, but in any cases.
Oh.
I mean, I've heard that, and I'm actually pretty much aware that they do hold that information sometimes. You mentioned data is sometimes held. That leads to a suspicion on my part that sometimes they don't want to be second-guessed.
I-
That's why they're not releasing it.
I agree,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. And then also in Colorado, a Washington Times article recently quoted Governor Hickenlooper as saying that slanted advice is being given by the Fish and Wildlife staff on the issue of whether the Gunnison sage grouse should be listed. Do you agree or disagree with that statement of the governor's?
Well, I agree that fish relies on certain scientists over others, even though they're experts in a field. They have preferences, and those preferences can, in some cases, lead to slanted opinions and observations.
Thank you.